CutThrough Proxy on the ASA. Wouldn't it be great if the firewall could stop users before they hit the servers and verify who they are? Well, that's what CutThrough Proxy is all about. Let's jump in. Let's imagine that we're given a new requirement. Our boss comes to us and says, hey guys, check it out. I know you've got this web server. It's on the internet, and based on what you told me, you set up network address translation, you created an access list allowing port 80, and that's all well and good, but unfortunately, we don't want it really to be a public web server. We only want it available to a certain few users. Can you help? Well, what are our options if that came up? One option would be we could control access at the server itself. We could have people connect, do user authentication here, and if they don't authenticate, then close the connection. But the problem with that is they've already got access through the firewall. Why not stop their traffic here at the firewall instead and ask them to authenticate there? That, my friends, is what CutThrough Proxy is all about. We can train an ASA that when inbound traffic is coming into a certain server to, on behalf of the server, stop that traffic, ask the user who they are, and if they are a valid user, only then allow that traffic to continue down to the server. So what is CutThrough Proxy, and in fact, why do they even call it that? On the first packet, let's say we have Bob right here, and Bob is going to access the server. When his packets first show up here, the ASA stops him and says, hey, I need to know who you are. And that can in effect be thought of as going all the way up to the application layer of the OSI reference model, or in this case, the TCP/IP protocol suite, and taking time to authenticate that user. Once the user is authenticated, the packet can go down and we can ship it out. So the first packet, we authenticate the user. Now what about the second packet from Bob? Well, the ASA knows that Bob's address is maybe 23.1.2.3 or whatever Bob's address is on the global internet, or whatever it appears to be. And it will remember that address and that Bob is authenticated. And guess what it does for the second packet and the third packet? It doesn't have to go ahead and authenticate every one. It can cut through that entire process and just make forwarding decisions based on layer 3 because he already knows who Bob is. So the first packet goes all the way up to the application layer logically, and then the subsequent packets can cut through that process. Hence it's called CutThrough, and we're proxying on behalf of the server behind here. So that's why it's called CutThrough Proxy. Why would we need it? In the event that we want to authenticate a user as they're trying to go through the network. In this case, for as users on the outside are trying to go to the DMZ. And how do we configure it? I'm glad you asked. Let's do that in ASDM right now. I was just thinking we probably ought to verify that basic web services work first before we try to lock it down with authentication. So this is from the outside going to the mapped address of that DMZ server, and we just want to verify that it works. Okay, so the web server is functioning. Let's set up the authentication. So to set up the authentication, a couple of things we'd want to look at first. Under configuration and device management, we'd want to make sure that we had AAA servers that were set up, or if we're going to use the local database, at least one local user account. For this demonstration, we'll use the local database on the ASA. To put in the requirement for the authentication, we'd go to configuration, firewall, AAA rules, and from here we'd simply say, I want to add a new authentication rule. I want to say that any traffic coming in on the outside interface, we're going to use the local database to authenticate them. They can be coming from any IP address, and they're destined for the IP address of our DMZ server. And this is one of the really cool things about NAT in 8.3 and higher of the ASA, and that is anytime we have access list or AAA policy rules, we point to the real IP address, even though the global address is something different. That way we can focus on the single item and not have to worry about the translations based on which interface it went out of. So we'll say DMZ server, we'll click on OK to that, and I want to authenticate only if it's HTTP traffic, so I'll select that as well. From any IP address to the DMZ server, if it's HTTP, we'll click on OK and we'll apply it. So it creates an access list that says traffic matches if it's TCP from anywhere to the DMZ server and the destination port equals 80. And this is the magic that turns it on. AAA authentication is required if there's a match on this access list, which is the line above, and traffic is coming in on the outside interface. I want to use the local database. And in the ASA, the keyword local has to be in uppercase to refer to the running config for user account authentication. We'll click on send, and without further ado, we'll bring up that same browser one more time. And here's that browser window. So we'll just open up that same URL or the same IP address, 192.168.1.176, the global address. And this time it's prompting me for credentials. So I'm going to go in as admin. Password is something that I put in for password. And there it goes. Now we can verify this also by going to the command line interface. Now that we've authenticated, we can do a show, UAUTH, for show current users who are authenticated. And it says, yeah, there's a user called admin. His absolute timeout is 1 hour and the inactivity timeout is 5 minutes. Those are not the defaults. The actual defaults are 5 minutes for absolute timeout, and there's no inactivity timer set by default. So these are some slightly tweaked parameters on this ASA that I'm working with right here. So what have we addressed or covered in this nugget? Number one, we identified what is cut-through proxy. It's the ability for the ASA to stop traffic as it's coming in, and on behalf of another device, the proxy part of it, it can authenticate the user all the way up at the application layer. Once we know who the user is, the ASA remembers the user and the source IP address. For future packets, it can cut through that entire process just to do basic forwarding at layer 3 for the future packets until that user's authentication session ends. Why do we need it? If we want to control who can get to our services and verify who they are before the ASA forwards it to the server, it's a perfect application, and we configure it as a firewall rule under the AAA section. I've had a lot of fun discussing cut-through proxy with you. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.